Good day. Today is Sunday, 1st June 2025, and as you can see, I'm back in London after my incredibly enjoyable trip with my family, holiday with my family in the English countryside. But I won't be staying in London for very long, just a few hours, because I'm in the process of packing my bags to visit Tbilisi, on the way to Tbilisi, the capital of the Caucasian Republic of Georgia, where I shall be attending a conference on geopolitical matters and various other such related matters, generously hosted by the city of Tbilisi, and where I will be meeting for the first time in person a number of people who are also attending that conference and who we have been privileged to host as guests on the Duran. So I'm very much looking forward to this trip. I've never been to Georgia before. I've never been to the Caucasus before. Greece and Georgia have very, very long interconnections with each other. Some of you may know the legend of Jason and the Golden Fleece. It is not perhaps fully appreciated by many of the people in the West who are familiar with that story, which was also, by the way, the subject or the topic of a once quite famous film, just saying. Anyway, perhaps few people realise that the country of the Golden Fleece, the country which Jason and the Argonauts eventually go to, is in fact Georgia. Anyway, so I will be there. I'll be there for about a week. I should be in full internet contact. I fully intend to continue to do programs throughout that time for this channel, and I will continue my interactions, obviously, with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou at the Duran. And once this trip to Georgia is over, then I will be returning, obviously, to London, and I will be in London for the next couple of months. I have no plans to travel anywhere else during the summer months, at least no plans for the moment. Now, since I am still in the process, as I said, of going from one place to another, again, this program will be shorter than some of the programs I used to do before I started on my various travels. And, well, apologies for that. But as I said, I'm afraid, the nature of this time. This is, if you like, the conference season. Anyway, let's talk now about what is happening in the world, and to be more precise, what is happening in the conflict in Ukraine. I am aware that these programs tend to be heavily focused on Ukraine. But as I've said in many programs, it remains my clear view that this is the major catalyst in shaping the global geopolitical environment. It is the conflict around which international affairs is currently organized. And it is this program it's this conflict which ultimately shapes the future which we're all very soon going to see, and which in a few years' time will become, of course, our present. Anyway, so what has been going on? Well, in my program yesterday, I made a comment which has not aged at all well. I said that it seemed to me that Senator Lindsey Graham, appeared to be slightly moderating his stance, and this might reflect an agreement that appeared to have been reached within the administration, that the limits had now been reached, and that unless there was a political and diplomatic breakthrough over the next couple of days, as a result of the Istanbul talks, which are happening tomorrow, then finally the United States is indeed going to walk away and will leave the future conduct of the conflict to Europe, to the Europeans. Well, about Lindsey Graham, about the rest I still believe I'm right, but about Lindsey Graham, I was certainly and entirely and completely wrong. Senator Graham, far from changing his stance on Ukraine or on any other matter, was in fact in Kiev at the time I was making my program, the time I made my program. He might have just been about to leave, I'm not sure. But anyway, he'd just been to Kiev, he'd met Zelensky, he'd met other Ukrainian officials, and there was no moderation in anything that he said at all. He made a number of very interesting to people like me, I'm not sure that they're interesting to the wider world, comments. He continued to talk about his bone-crushing sanctions, this great bill of bone-crushing sanctions that he still has in mind. But he also very interestingly said that it is completely untrue that Ukraine is losing the war. This is all apparently Russian propaganda, and in fact Ukraine is successfully holding its own, as can be shown by the fact that if you look at the map last year and you compare it with the map this year, you will find that there has been actually very little change. And for the record, I've seen other people make the same claim. There's an article today in Unheard, the centre-left British magazine, which has appeared recently, which claims, I don't know with what truth, that over the course of 2024, over the course of the whole year, in fact, since 2024, some indeterminate date in 2024, the Russians have supposedly only been able to capture 0.6% of the territory of Ukraine, so that there is no truth, no reality in the claim that the Russians are in fact winning the war. Now, the interesting thing about Senator Lindsey Graham is that he's one of these people who, unlike the Bourbons in France, seems to learn nothing and forget everything. I say that because I can clearly remember him going to Kiev in, I believe it was early June 2023, to be briefed by the Ukrainians on their summer 2023 offensive, counteroffensive, the one that was supposed to break through to the Sea of Azov and to the Black Sea, and which was supposed to defeat the Russians. And Lindsey Graham, I remember, came out of the meetings he had with the Ukrainians saying that all was going to be very well, that the Ukrainians had briefed him, that he liked what he had heard, that victory was, in effect, around the corner. Well, he might not have used those words, but certainly that was the impression that he conveyed. So the offensive that he was briefed about in June 2023 duly came about, and it ended in disastrous defeat. The Russians defeated it comprehensively, and Ukraine has been on the back foot ever since. Well, it doesn't seem to me as if Senator Lindsey Graham has learned anything from that experience. He comes and he's briefed by the Ukrainians all over again, and he likes what he hears, and all is well, and the Ukrainians are holding their own, and all the stories and reports and claims about the Russians advancing and winning the war, why that is mere Russian propaganda. In the minds of people like Lindsey Graham, what the Russians say is always propaganda and therefore untrue. What the Ukrainians say is never propaganda, it is always true. And apparently nothing like massive defeats over the course of 2023, the complete failure, disastrous defeat of the offensive that Senator Graham was so happy to be briefed about in June 2023. Nothing that happens ever is able to change his approach to this, his understanding of these events. The possibility that the Russians are telling the truth and that the Ukrainians are not is not one that he ever appears to want to contemplate at all. Anyway, that's Senator Lindsey Graham. I'm not going to waste more time with him. What he's told by the Ukrainians and what he believes is ultimately of absolutely no importance at all. Whether he will be able to mobilize Congress to support his bone-crushing sanctions, of course, is important. For the record, I doubt it. But anyway, let's move on and let's look at what others are saying. And General Kellogg has been saying rather more in the last couple of hours. And he gave an interview on Fox, and he admitted straightforwardly that this is a proxy war between the United States and Russia. The conflict in Ukraine is a proxy war between the United States and Russia. He, which is to say Putin, this is a direct quote from General Kellogg, considers this a proxy war by NATO as well right now, and frankly, in a way, it is. I mean, you look at what European nations have done with support. I mean, it's clearly Putin sees that. So it's a proxy war. General Kellogg has told us this. Secretary of State Rubio has said much the same. We on the Duran have been talking about it as a proxy war going all the way back to 2022. We've been saying that the entire Ukraine conflict going back to 2014 is a proxy war between the West and Russia. And General Kellogg, somewhat belatedly, has come forward and admitted to that as well. Now, to repeat again, I don't actually think that this word proxy war remotely adequately describes what has actually been happening in Ukraine over the last 3 years. A couple of weeks ago, the New York Times and the London Times confirmed the extent to which the United States and Britain in particular had been basically running the entire war against Russia in Ukraine. They'd been making the plans, commanding the armies, deciding what equipment should be provided to Ukraine, giving orders to Ukrainian generals, providing the Ukrainians with the communications and the intelligence, providing the targeting data, launching the missiles in accordance with that targeting data. It is not a proxy war, as I've described it in several places. It is better understood as yet another in a long series of coalition wars extending back to the early 19th century that the Western powers have waged against Russia. But I'm not going to spend more time discussing that today, not in this program. Anyway, that's General Kellogg. General Kellogg also again reiterated that the Americans and the Europeans together, it turns out, have come up with a 22-point plan for a ceasefire. He accepts that both the Ukrainians and the Russians are unhappy with it. He doesn't say very much about what reasons the Ukrainians have for being unhappy with this 22-point plan, which is clearly, essentially, Kellogg's plan. What we do know is that the Russians rejected this plan outright some time ago, and that when Steve Witkoff was supposed to go to Moscow to present it to Putin, the Russians refused to host him. They said that this plan made so little sense as far as they were concerned that they were not interested in it. Now, that's Kellogg, and I am aware that many people think I'm giving too much time to him. But I will say this, there has, it seems to me, been an evolution, not so much in what Kellogg thinks, but in what Kellogg says and what he's been saying over the last couple of days, he now is admitting that this is a proxy war. He now confirms that NATO has been involved in that proxy war with Russia. He's come out and said that Ukraine cannot expect to join NATO, at least not for the time being, because the United States is opposed to that. He seems to accept that it was in fact the drive to bring Ukraine into NATO that was the ultimate root cause and issue that led directly to the war. I only partly agree with this view, by the way. My own view is that the war, the moment that the conflict in Ukraine truly began, was in February 2014, when the seizure of power took place in Kiev, and that sooner or later that would have exploded into a war, and that though the events of 2008 were of immense importance, it was still possible to avoid a war until the events of February 2014. But never mind. Anyway, Kellogg appears to accept all of that. And he also, when he says that if the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia fail, that the United States will walk away, he's making it fairly clear now that in that case, the burden of the war will fall on the Europeans, and that the Americans will start to dissociate themselves to the extent that they can from it. And as I discussed also in my program yesterday, there's been a meeting of EU officials, European officials in The Hague, and they were apparently sunk in despondency and gloom, because they also now finally understand that the point is now coming when the Americans are not going to be as involved in supplying weapons and equipment to Ukraine as we have seen happen up to this time. So that's Kellogg. And the fact that Kellogg is talking in this way does suggest to me that at some point over the last 2 or 3 weeks, some kind of discussion has taken place within the administration, and it's now been gradually acknowledged that in fact we've now reached the point where the United States has to make a decision. Does it continue with Ukraine, or does it walk away? And that if there is no agreement over the next couple of days in Istanbul, the point will finally have been reached for the United States to walk away. Now, Kellogg also, over the course of his recent comments, made it very, very clear that the United States will not be happy at all. They will be furious, in fact, if Zelensky does not send a team of negotiators to Istanbul tomorrow to meet with the Russians. Well, as of the time of making of this program, the Ukrainians continue to be defiant about this. They are still giving no hint at all that they're going to send anybody to Istanbul at all tomorrow. They're still rather sulkily saying that they need to see the memorandum, the Russian memorandum, in advance, and Russia's response to their own ceasefire proposals in advance, and that they're not prepared simply to accept these documents by hand at the meeting in Istanbul on Monday. So it's not clear that we are going to see the Ukrainians turn up tomorrow. I suspect that eventually they will. That will go through, as I said, the same tiresome circus that we saw before the meeting in Istanbul on the 16th of May. But eventually the Ukrainians will send their people to Istanbul tomorrow. And it'll be very interesting to see what happens, however, if they don't. Will the Russians simply return to Moscow? And will they then continue to say that they're not prepared to hand over their memorandum and their ceasefire proposals or response to the Ukrainian ceasefire proposals until there is a guarantee of an actual meeting, and at the meeting itself? In other words, do they sit on their proposals until the Ukrainians respond? Payback, if you like, for Ukraine's failure in April 2022 to respond to the Russian proposals that were made at that time and which were sent to the Ukrainians without the Ukrainians ever responding to them. Could it be that that is what the Russians will do? What will the Americans say? Or will the Russians finally come round and communicate to the Ukrainians and to the Americans their proposals and, well, in effect, concede the point? I don't know, and we'll have to wait and see. And what will the Americans also do if the Ukrainians don't go to Istanbul tomorrow? One thing I can say with confidence is that whatever the Ukrainians decide to do, the Europeans will continue to back them. The Europeans will continue to support Ukraine through thick and thin. It doesn't seem to me as if there is any change in European policy in that regard. Certainly, they will continue to support any decision by Zelensky to refuse to send negotiators to Istanbul on Monday. Anyway, we will see how it plays out. Meanwhile, there was a meeting of the UN Security Council, I believe on the 30th of May. It was addressed by Russia's formidable ambassador, Vasily Nebenzia. He made it absolutely clear, again, that the Russians, as far as I can see, that the Russians are not giving an inch on any of their underlying demands, the demands that they have been making since 14th June 2024, Putin's speech at that time to the foreign ministry on how the conflict could end. On the position with respect to a ceasefire, my sense was that Nebenzia actually further hardened Russian positions. That the Russians not only are insisting that in the event that there is a ceasefire, arms deliveries during the period of the ceasefire from the West to Ukraine should cease, and that Ukraine should cease to receive intelligence information. But he appeared also to say that Ukraine should stop all further mobilization during the period of the ceasefire, a proposal which I think the Ukrainians will certainly consider unreasonable and which they will undoubtedly reject. Anyway, it was a formidable speech by Vasily Nebenzia. But what was interesting about the meeting of the Security Council is that it seemed to me that the Chinese ambassador was giving very strong support to the Russians indeed. He also seemed to say that the only way that the conflict could be resolved would be if the root causes of the conflict was addressed. And my own sense was that the Russians and the Chinese had clearly coordinated in advance before the Security Council meeting, and that they used the opportunity provided by the meeting to present a joint or at least a complementary response. Anyway, there it is. So we will see what happens tomorrow, whether the Ukrainians go or whether they stay in Kiev, how they respond. As I said, it's a tiresome and boring story, but in the meantime, the war continues Now, before I touch on relatively briefly the actual events of the war in the last 24 hours, I think it might be interesting to discuss an article which has appeared in Bloomberg, which gives us some idea of what Western militaries, the actual people who are professionals, if you like, about the war, are actually thinking about the way in which the war has been conducted by the Russians over the last 3 years. And it is a very interesting article. It is by Mark Champion, and its title is "Putin Worries NATO Much More Than You Think." And the article then starts interestingly in this way. In debates over Russia, the argument often comes down to a simple proposition. Having struggled for 3 years and seen his forces mauled in Ukraine, is it really plausible that President Putin would take on the combined might of NATO? It's time to put that question to bed. I spent a day this week with a group of generals and other officers in uniform from around 20 countries. They had collected at Britain's Royal United Services Institute, that's Britain's major military think tank, to talk about the recreation of Army Corps as the primary head organisational unit for fighting wars. These are the large combined services formations we thought redundant once the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, but now, largely thanks to Putin, they're back in fashion. And then he goes on to say this. What I walked away with was that the understanding that those who would have to do any fighting aren't asking if the threat of a Russian attack on a NATO country is real, but rather where, when, and in what form it comes. Their biggest concern is how little time they may have to prepare. At the start of the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, NATO commanders were as surprised as anyone else by the ineptness of the Russian assault on Kiev, a debacle that saw the cream of Moscow's combat troops and equipment destroyed. But any complacency that follows has now gone. Rather than 5 to 10 years, as once thought, the working estimate for when Putin might have the capabilities to take on NATO has transformed. And we're told that it's 6 months for localized attacks, 2 years for a Baltic war, 5 years for a wider European conflict. The combat force Russia has in the field is by now twice as large as the one that carried out the invasion in 2022, and it continues to recruit. Production of arms and weaponry has soared. Exposure to advanced Western weaponry has allowed the Russians time to figure out how to neutralize them. The absolute advantage Ukraine once held in battlefield innovation has evaporated. The Russian Air Force, built to fight NATO, is modern and has been preserved intact. Again, I heard something approaching admiration for the speed at which Russian forces have learnt and adapted in Ukraine. In terms of drone and electronic warfare, Russia is probably ahead of NATO. The war has proved that having a small number of exquisitely capable unmanned aircraft can't compete for impact with sheer quantity and adaptability. Less well understood is that Russia also has been improving the accuracy and survivability of its cruise and ballistic missiles. The Iskander, a rough equivalent to the US ATACMS, it is in fact much more advanced, but never mind, has become difficult even for US-made Patriot batteries to intercept. In fact, they can't intercept it, but never mind. And it's getting used to hit everything from HIMARS launchers to Ukrainian command posts. More sobering for Western generals is the continued demonstration of Russia's near total indifference to casualty rates. Now here I am going to take a massive issue. I think the Russians care about casualty rates a great deal, but I think the West completely overstates them. And the article then goes on to say that this creates a latitude for Putin and his generals that NATO counterparts don't have. What is true is that no West European army could sustain the kind of battle damage that Russian and Ukrainian armies have suffered over the course of the war. None of them has the kind of depth and resilience, not to mention reserves, that would enable them to do that. And we're then told that one speaker after another at the Russia conference spoke of the need to shift their own priorities towards force protection and the expectation of Europe's political leaders and populations towards high casualty rates. That is going to be an incredibly difficult sell, by the way, to the European public in total. Well, anyway, let me just make a few quick observations about this article. First of all, I think the story about ineptitude by the Russians in February 2022 is a massively overstated story. Putin himself, in a recent interview with Pavel Zarubin, has admitted that the Russian forces in February 2022 were far too few to achieve a military outcome to the war. Russia was not sufficiently strong or sufficiently mobilized in February 2022 to achieve that. According to Putin, it is today, 3 years on, constant mobilization of men and machines, the mobilization of Russia's industrial base, the assistance provided mostly, I suspect, by North Korea. All of that has transformed the situation completely, and today Russia is in a much, much more powerful military position than it was in February 2022. And I think that is true, and I don't think there is any doubt about that. And I think it is also true, obviously, that since 2022, the Russians have indeed massively upgraded the scale of their military. They've built up their huge reserve armies. They've developed a massive understanding of drone warfare, probably unmatched by anyone else. Their electronic warfare capabilities, which were always considerable, have now reached an entirely new level. Their air force is much more effective than it was. Their fab bombs are produced in numbers which simply didn't exist in February 2022. And, well, altogether, their military is far more powerful, and their society is far more geared, and their economy is far more geared to this kind of war than any Western economy is. I don't think, and I want to make this absolutely clear, that any of this translates to a Russian objective to attack NATO. They have repeatedly said that they have no such plans, and I see no reason to doubt them. Why would they want to? What would be the purpose of doing so? Nobody ever sits back and explains this. There's never been any discussion in the West of why the Russians would want to advance on Berlin or Paris or London or Madrid or take over Scandinavia or do any of those kind of things, especially given the enormous risks. But What we do see from this article is that NATO generals, having started from an attitude of deep contempt for the Russians, are now evolving to one of, as the article says, effective admiration. Something approaching admiration for the speed at which Russians have learnt and adapted to the conflict in Ukraine. And I think this is true. It is, in fact, something that I'm hearing all the time. Admiration, of course, with strong elements of fear, because in the West, the ability to change, the ability to adapt and to modernize and to rethink battle strategies and to rebuild military industrial bases simply does not exist in the degree and to the scale that we see that the Russians have achieved. And that might explain certain really alarming comments made recently by people like Colonel Richard Kemp, British military officer, former British military officer, who writes extensively for the Daily Telegraph. I've quoted his pieces many times. He is now openly calling for the Western powers to basically throw away the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and to supply nuclear weapons to the Ukrainians. Now, this isn't the first time he said that. When Zelensky, back in the autumn and winter of 2024, was floating the possibility of Ukraine acquiring nuclear weapons, I remember that Colonel Kemp at that time basically and quietly supported them in that. Now he seems to be going further still and to be speaking openly about this. And the reason for that is because the Europeans, the United States, are putting together the numbers and are understanding that they cannot hope to take on the Russians in conventional terms. The idea of sending European troops, British and French troops, to Ukraine appears to be dead. We haven't been hearing much of this plan now for some time. The idea of establishing no-fly zones over Ukraine appears to be, for the moment, dead as well. And for all of these reasons, as it's gradually come to be understood that a conventional military defeat of the Russians is impossible, we start to see some people escalating and considering these incredibly dangerous and alarming ideas of basically, as I said, doing away with the nuclear non-proliferation treaty and starting to arm the Ukrainians with nuclear weapons. An idea, by the way, that which, if it were ever adopted, would certainly provoke a response from the Russians, one which might indeed include use of tactical nuclear weapons, something which up to now the Russians have never shown any intention of wanting to do. Anyway, there it is. Growing alarm in the West, military alarm in the West about the growth of Russian military power. And when you go on and read further this article from Bloomberg, there's no real sign that they've really come up with any genuine plan of what they should do in order to counter it. Certainly, they don't have any plan to counter the advance of the Russian army in Ukraine. Now, that brings us back to this endless narrative, the one that gets constantly recycled, the one that was floated in that article by Unheard, the one that's come from Senator Graham, that, the Russians haven't made any huge military progress over the course of the conflict in the last year, they've only gained 0.6% of Ukraine's territory. That means that it's simply not true that the Russians are winning the war or anything of that kind. The reality is, and this has been pointed out now by so many people over such a long time, but perhaps most eloquently and elegantly by Alex Vashinin, who of course is a commentator for the Royal United Services Institute, and Brian Beletic. This is a war of attrition. Way back in February 2022, Alex, Christoforo and I published a discussion on the Duran. I think it was a live stream in which we discussed the war and in which we explained that the Russians have always thought of war in Clausewitzian terms, that for them, capture of territory is never the objective. It is the destruction of the enemy's ability to continue fighting. And that means, first and foremost, the destruction of the enemy's army. That has always been the Russian way of waging war. And you can see that, by the way, if you follow all of the history of the way in which the Russians have been conducting wars since the late 18th century. And it's absolutely the way they've conducted this one. And we're starting to see the effects, because we're not starting to see the effects. We are now definitely seeing the effects. Because if I now turn briefly to what is going on in the war itself, the information is now of the Russians advancing not just on every part of the front lines, but of taking more and more territory across the front lines. Now, a couple of days ago, as it looked like the entire Ukrainian defense south of Konstantinovka, the southernmost town in the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk Konstantinovka conurbation, that entire defense position was about to collapse, and that Pokrovsk itself was at risk of encirclement. Anyway, the Ukrainians, in response to that, rushed forces from Sumy region, from the north, from Kharkiv and Sumy region, to try to plug the gaps in the Konstantinovka Pokrovsk area. And reports at that time were straightforwardly acknowledging that the reason that the Ukrainians were obliged to do this is because they're short of men and they are critically short of infantry. In fact, we've had reports that trenches across the front lines are often deserted. There are no Ukrainian troops manning them, and that the Ukrainians have had to depend on drones to try to hold back the Russians. And as we now see, increasingly every day, it is in fact the Russians who have an overwhelming superiority in drones and who are beginning to swamp the skies with drones, with the imbalance increasing over time. Now, why is the Ukrainian army short of infantry? There's a straightforward explanation, which is that they have suffered impossibly high losses, which they can't make up. Whatever the scale of Russian losses, they are indeed able to make those up. The Russians have released information that since the start of this year, a further 180,000 contracts have been made, people joining the Russian military. There is, as Simplicius the thinker says, a constant churn. People join the military, sometimes just for 6 months, then quit, then join again, then all kinds of things go on. But the Russians have no difficulty maintaining and increasing the size of their forces and making up for any losses, whereas the Ukrainians are not able to do this. They cannot make up for manpower losses. They can't make up for losses in material either. And they are steadily losing the drone wars and the drone war. And so the result is that attrition is now starting to have its effect. The Russians are gaining more ground every day and faster. According to Bild Zeitung, they've captured 18 built-up areas over the course of the last week. Some of these were fairly heavily fortified. At one time, it might take the Russians a whole week to capture a fortified village. Today, they're able to capture them at growing speed. They now apparently are in the process, for example, of capturing the heavily fortified village of Yunakovka in the Sumy region. According to some reports, they control around 50% of it. That's just one example. And they're able to keep pushing and advancing all the time in every place continuously. And the Ukrainians not only are not able to hold them back because they don't have the men and the machines to hold them back, but the days when they were able to launch counterattacks are passing. There's been talk at various times of the Ukrainians launching their own further counteroffensives, but we're hearing less and less about this because the holes cannot any longer be plugged. Now, that doesn't mean that the Ukrainians don't have tricks still up their sleeve. Over the last couple of hours, there's been reports that a number of bridges in Russian-controlled territory, in Bryansk and Kursk region and in Zaporozhye, have been blown up by Ukrainian saboteurs. I've seen photographs of some of these bridges. Obviously, the purpose of these attacks is to disrupt Russian logistics. It's interesting, by the way, that the Ukrainians are now having to turn to this kind of sabotage as opposed to HIMARS strikes, which is what they would have done at an earlier stage in the conflict, or drone strikes, which is something that they would also have attempted at an earlier period of the conflict, or ATACMS, or using their own missiles like the Tochka U. The fact that they're obliged to turn to sabotage attacks suggests that they're running out of missiles and that they are coming to realize the ineffectiveness of their drones. But having said this, this is a blow for the Russians. It disrupts their logistics, particularly in the northern regions. I've seen pictures of the railway bridges. However, they're not massive bridges. The Russians have a very, very well organized support systems for their railways. I suspect that it will take them just a few days before they get all of these bridges back into a state of repair. And for the record, I suspect that the Russian railway system is resilient enough and complex enough now in order to absorb this damage and do so without excessive difficulty, so that logistics and supplies will still be able to get through. Incidentally, about a week ago, there was pictures of a Ukrainian drone attack on a Russian train, logistics train, in Zaporozhye region, which in effect confirmed that the railway lines from Russia to Crimea and to Zaporozhye and Kherson are indeed built and repaired and are now in operation. That particular train, as I said, was destroyed, but of course there are other trains that are sent, and the problems, the Russian logistics can still function. In fact, I'm going to suggest that with the new railway lines established in Zaporozhye and Kherson region, and with the railway lines in southern Donbass through places like Ugledar, for example, and Avdiivka, now probably bought under repair and functioning, I'm going to make a suggestion that probably Russian logistics overall are in much better shape now than they have probably been at any point previously in the conflict. That is not to deny that there has been a very serious lapse of security in especially Bryansk and Kursk regions, with these Ukrainian saboteurs able to plant these explosive charges under these bridges. Apparently there were reports about 10 days ago of the presence of Ukrainian saboteurs in this area, but and even reports that parts of this area had been closed as the Russian security services looked to try and track down these saboteurs. But as we see, some of them did manage to get through and plant their explosive devices, and it must be seen as a significant failure in Russian security that this actually happened. There are some claims, by the way, that this particular sabotage group that entered Russia did so not through the Russian-Ukrainian border, which is now heavily defended, but via Belarus. And there's even some suggestions that some of the people who were involved in this operation might have been Belarusian dissidents who would have been able to travel across the border from Belarus without encountering any major problems. I don't know whether that is so, and I'm not going to spend more time debating it. But whatever the Ukrainians are able to do to disrupt the Russian logistics in this way, it's only going to have an effect for a few more days, whereas the attrition crisis that Ukraine is experiencing is unsolvable. And going back to what Alex Vershinin said in in his most recent article about this particular conflict, attrition wars end suddenly when one side finally loses the ability to keep on fighting, can no longer plug the holes. Then the collapse comes, and at that point it comes fast. At which moment, of course, forces can start to move much more quickly. Large areas of territory can be captured very, very quickly. And then at that point, as I said, everything ends quickly as well. Now, that isn't to suggest, by the way, that the Russians have not, in fact, captured important territory over the course of the last year. They've captured places which the Ukrainians went to great lengths to fortify and to defend, places like Ugledar and Avdiivka, and major logistic points for the Ukrainians like Kurakhovo and Selidovo. And the Russians are now, of course, also very close to capturing Siversk and perhaps Liman, and that they are on the outskirts now of the core towns, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinivka, and I personally believe that they have already entered and that there is fighting going on in southern Pokrovsk. So, we could see over the course of the next couple of weeks, months, major Ukrainian positions captured, and positions that the Russians have captured over the last year were some of the most heavily fortified and passionately defended positions that the Ukrainians have. But of course, and to repeat again, it starts to get easier for the Russians. The further west they go, they begin to break through the spider's web of industrial towns and railway communications and industrial buildings that you find in Donbass. The country does open up the further west the Russians go. And of course their forces become stronger even as the Ukrainian forces get weaker. So anyway, that's what I wanted to say today about the state of the war. I think that this summer is going to be seen as the final and decisive turning point in the war. I don't believe that the Ukrainians are in a position, will be in a position to sustain the war for very long without the United States. I certainly do not believe, by the way, that it is going to be possible to use the Europeans to launder American weapons to the Ukrainians. I think the logistic complexities in doing that are extreme, and it requires massive expenditure by European governments, which they probably don't have. And I don't understand why the Americans would even want to do that, to be honest. So I think that we are probably, as I said, reaching that final tipping point when, as I said, the war will, we will see the breakthrough finally happen. Le Temps, the French newspaper, spoke about Ukraine's desperate need for the fighting to stop, for a ceasefire. But there is no sign that the Ukrainians' leadership understands or acknowledges this. My own sense is that Zelensky, at least, wants the war to continue. He was very reluctant to agree to a ceasefire in the first place. He only did so after the Americans forced him to, when they cut off military supplies and intelligence assistance for about a week. He's run with the idea of a ceasefire since then, but never with especially good grace. And I think he still believes and still assumes that if things get really bad for Ukraine, the Europeans or the Americans will run to his rescue. Professor Sachs, I think, has put it very well when he said that this is delusional, that there are no European musketeers going to rush to Ukraine's rescue. I think that, like many people, Zelensky simply cannot get his hand round the fact that the West ultimately has only finite capabilities, and it is not in a position to devote more of them to Ukraine than it already has, and that the limits of those capabilities are being reached. Even if Zelensky did understand that, I am not convinced, even then, that he would want to end the war. And we're probably going to find tomorrow, when the meeting in Istanbul happens, and when, as we will see, the Ukrainians either turn up or don't, we will get a further clue then as to what it is exactly that the Ukrainians, at this stage of the conflict, intend to do. Well, this is where I finish today's program. As I said, my next program will be from Georgia. And until then, all that remains is for me to wish you the best. I will be back tomorrow with a video, just to say, made in Georgia. And in the meantime, let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Please remember that if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.